Other features of depositional coastlines are things called either a spit or a barrier beach, and they're both slightly different in what they are, but they form in very similar ways. So these are accumulations of sediment that is usually transported down along a beach by longshore drift. Here we can actually see the longshore drift direction in the picture on the left-hand side. How do we know that's the longshore drift direction? Well, we see that there's a lot of sediment being piled up sort of in that lower mid right-hand side of the colored image. So we get this accumulation of sediment, and it can be caused by longshore drift being interrupted either by a natural obstruction or by a human man-made obstruction. And what happens is this longshore drift, which is transporting sediment down along the coastline, is obstructed, is it stopped, it's going to start to deposit the sediment and form either a spit or a barrier beach. So looking at a spit specifically, if we were to define it, how would we describe it? A linear accumulation of sediment that is attached to the land at one end. So it's basically this long bit of sediment that sticks out. If we were to dig down underneath the sediment, we'd find that there's no sort of rocky core or rocky basement underneath it. It's just this deposit as sediment. Longshore current, longshore drift brings sediment down along the coastline, hits an obstruction, it might hit calmer water, and that material starts to be deposited. Why does material become deposited? Why is sediment deposited when a current hits calmer water? Well, it's because the velocity decreases. You need faster moving water, faster velocities, higher velocities to move coarser grained material. If you have a decrease in velocity, the ability of that current to transport sediment of a certain size decreases. If we hit really calm in water, there's almost not enough energy for that current to transport any size of particles. So we just deposit everything. Mud-sized grains, silt-sized grains, clay-sized grains, sand-sized grains. And through this we build up the spit over time. The spit might have a little curve at the end, a little hook, and that's because wave refraction. Remember, waves are still operating. They're hitting this coastline sometimes at different angles. Bending of these waves might result in the formation of a little hook or something that we call a recurved spit. Here we have a very large spit called the Farewell Spit at the northern tip of New Zealand's South Island. So you can see it extending off to the right, that long, narrow barrier of sand. One of the things about spits are the sort of the orientation, not the general overall orientation, but the end of the spit. That position of the end of the spit can actually change over time depending on prevailing wind directions, current directions. Sometimes you'll see a seasonality to current and wind directions. So some parts of the year it might be pointing in one direction, other parts of the year it might be hooking or sort of hooking over into another direction. But that's going to be at the very far end of the spit. And then you can see on the back side of the spit, so sort of coming down towards the bottom of the slide, we see a lot of additional sediment being deposited. And this could be sediment that's being carried over the top of the spit by wave activity during storms. Sometimes you may observe a structure that's very spit-like, but it's not a true spit. Instead, it's something called a tombolo. And here we have a tombolo. This is from Japan. And what we'll see is this narrow, once again, sort of band strip of sediment, but it's attached to the mainland on one end, but the other end we see a sea island. And if we looked onto that island and we looked at the center of it, we looked at what is making up the bottom of it, sort of the subsurface of it, what is the basement, what's the core of that sea island, what would see it's the same rock type as the mainland. This is a case of where this used to be attached to the mainland. There's solid rock at the base, at the core of it, and now either through erosion of rock in between it, it's now separated from mainland and only connected at low tides usually, sometimes even at high tides, by this narrow band of sediment known as a tombolo. So if you look underneath the tombolo, we don't have any like solid rock. This is all just sand, sediment, but it connects mainland to an island with a rocky core. So once again, if we were to give a formal definition in tombolo, a strip of sediment accumulating between an offshore island and the main shoreline formed as a result of wave refraction around the island. We have a little diagram here showing the formation of it. Once again, longshore drift plays a very important role in it. Moves sediment out, might initially start off as a spit, but then when that spit joins that island, it becomes a tombolo. And then we reach barrier islands. Barrier islands might appear very similar to a spit, but instead we see that they're not attached to the mainland at either end. They're their own separate entity. So if we once again were to define a barrier island, and here we're looking at Long Beach Barrier Island, which just lies off the south shore of Long Island in New York City, what we see is it's composed of finer, smaller grain sediment, stretches for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. It's a coastal landform orientated parallel to the mainland. Narrow strip, sometimes they're only like maybe 200-300 meters wide up to a couple kilometers wide on average, separated from the mainland by a protected lagoon or estuary. So that's sort of that back water area that we see behind the barrier island. In the landside image that we see up above, or the satellite image, that big green swath, which represents part of the island of New York, that actually isn't the barrier island. It's that really narrow band of land just sitting offshore near the bottom of the image. There are some basic parts of a barrier island. We see on the ocean side, the beach. Immediately behind the beach, we have dunes. Then we have an area called the back barrier area. We might see trees there. We might see it bordered by a salt marsh or tidal floods. And then finally, we move into the lagoon area and then mainland. So we have real life image right up here in the upper right hand corner, and then sort of the sketch down below that shows some of the main morphological features of a barrier island. The big thing to remember that these are all unconsolidated sediment, so there's no rocky core. It's just sitting there in the ocean, and as a result, it can be very easily, the material, the sand that makes up the barrier island, can be very easily transported either by longshore drift or by storm activity. A very common feature of barrier islands are overwash deposits, and here we have some examples of overwash deposits. The image on the top there, the bottom is the seaward side, the back side is the lagoon. You'll see these sort of like big white tongues of sediment that are extending out into the lagoon. These are known as overwash deposits, and they're a result of high energy waves. How do we get high energy waves? Well, these commonly occur and associated with large storms. It can be a tropical storm, a tropical cyclone, a hurricane. It could even be an extratropical storm. But the net result is this storm activity, this wave activity associated with the storm, you can also have a storm surge, will move sediment from the front of the island to the back of the island. Or if you have a house on the island, it'll move that house from the front to the back of the island or make it completely disappear. So these are known as overwash deposits because they're washing over the entire barrier island in many cases. As I stated in the previous slide, we typically see these in association with hurricanes. Here we have some overwash deposits. This is associated with Hurricane Sandy, which we talked about. And what you'll see here is that the yellow arrow points to the same location, and that beach has almost completely disappeared after the storm as a result of storm waves and the storm surge picking up all the sediment on the beach and moving it into that sort of that back barrier or lagoonal environment that sits behind the beach of the barrier island. The net result of these overwash deposits, especially in shorelines where storms are fairly regular activity, is over time the barrier islands actually begin to migrate or move landwards. So if you sort of observe the position of a barrier island, even over a period of 5 to 10 years, definitely over a period of 100 years or so, we'll see that over time it's moving closer and closer to the mainland. And this is a result of basically the sediment that forms an island being picked up and physically moved by storm surge activity, moved by wave activity to the back barrier environment and moving it closer to the mainland. We're looking at here an image from off the coast of Maryland. We have really nice extensive barrier islands along the east coast of the United States. Most of them are really developed as well. Here we see two islands called Assateague Island and Fenwick Island. On the little map, what we'll see is the position of Assateague Island and Fenwick Island in 1849 are outlined in red. The position in 1980 are the current ones shown in yellow. And you can see how over time, both islands have started to move closer to shore and sort of narrowing that lagoon that exists between the mainland and these barrier islands. If you are really observant, though, you'll notice, though, that Fenwick Island has moved nowhere near as much as Assateague Island. And why would that be? I mean, they're in fairly close proximity, so why is one moving closer to the shoreline and one isn't, or closer to mainland and one isn't? And as we'll see in the next slide, a lot of this has to do with development. Barrier islands, especially in some parts of the world, like around the eastern seaboard of the United States, become very popular locations to build on, to have a summer home on, to have a summer cottage on. So these islands will become very heavily developed. So here we're looking at Fenwick Island on the top part, Assateague Island on the bottom part, and an inlet known as Ocean City Inlet. What do we see? Well, Fenwick Island is heavily developed. So if you have a lot of pavement and a lot of housing developments, casinos, theme parks and all that, covering the sediment, there's a lot less sediment to pick up during a storm and move over into that back barrier environment to actually physically move that island closer to the mainland. So with development, it becomes much more difficult for these islands to migrate towards the mainland. Assateague Island, on the other hand, it's a naturally protected site, so there's really nothing growing on it. There's a whole herd of wild horses, and there's trees and dune grass, and things like that. But this is more in its natural state, and as a result, we see it after storms, this really rapid migration towards mainland. This might beg the question, are barrier islands a really good place to live? As we see here, this is the Chandeleur Islands in the Gulf of Mexico off of Louisiana. You can see 2001, really nice extensive island, might be a nice place to go and hang out for a day or so. After Hurricane Ivan in 2004 and then Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we've seen that particular island has almost, or these particular group of islands have almost completely disappeared. Studies have been done. Should we live on barrier islands? Here's a really good example. Once again, this looks back at Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy along the New Jersey shore. Once again, we have many barrier islands along there. And you can see post-hurricane that barrier island in one location has almost completely disappeared. All the material that was forming part of that barrier island has been brought back into that lagoonal area. Extensive coastal flooding. You can see some of the damage it has done to housing and roads within the area. So to answer the question, are barrier islands a good place to live? Well, this is really up to you to decide. In the United States, the National Research Council said, you know what, these islands are basically mobile landforms. Sure, we've kind of subsided or caused a cessation to the mobility due to building on it, but with an increase in storm activity, we find that, this might not be enough. So there is a growing school of thought out there that these might not be safe places for humans to live, because they're so mobile, and they're actually usually the first line of defense during hurricane and storms as well. If a storm surge hits the coastline, if a hurricane hits the coastline, especially if they're sort of bordered by these barrier islands and any infrastructure on them are going to bear the full brunt of that particular hurricane, of that particular storm surge. Another depositional feature that we see associated with coastlines are deltas. And deltas aren't always formed by longshore drift. Instead, what they are deposits of sediment that are found at a river mouth. So not only do we have deltas occurring in oceans, but we can also have deltas occurring in any body of water that a river empties into a lake, into even like a puddle. If you have a little stream entering into it, you might form a delta. So what we see here, this is a very typical delta. This is the Mississippi River Delta, a delta that's been studied for years and years and years. A couple things that we see here on this satellite image, once again falsely colored. All the sort of light blue colors are sediment that's being carried by the Mississippi River and deposited at the mouth here. Why is that deposition occurring? Well, once again, the velocity, the speed at which the river water is traveling decreases very quickly, very suddenly. It no longer is able to carry sediment of a certain size, and that just basically gets dropped in place as water, sediment within the water or suspended within the water. We also see here also those orangey red areas are all areas of vegetation. Deltas come in a number of different shapes and sizes. Depends on sort of the dominant processes. Is it a river-dominated delta? Is it dominated by the fact that the river's flowing into the ocean? Is it dominated by waves in that particular area? Is it dominated by the tidal activity in that particular area? But we see that we can classify deltas based on these sort of different types of processes, and that there are 3 end members. So we're not going to look at all different types of deltas, but we'll look at an example from one of each of these end members. We'll look at an example from the river end member, a river-dominated delta, a wave-dominated delta, and a tide-dominated delta. Here we have the classic example of a river-dominated delta. So here's yet another satellite image of the Mississippi River Delta entering into the Gulf of Mexico. We also call these bird's foot deltas because they're supposed to resemble the foot of a bird. The main sort of tributary, so that's the main channel that we see extending from the upper left-hand side of the image. You can think of it as the leg of the bird, and then all the distributary channels. These are all the smaller channels that kind of go branching out. We can think of these as sort of the claws or foot of the bird. So in a river-dominated delta, what happens is that the influence of that river flowing into the water is so great that any wave activity, and we especially have to have an area where there's very low wave activity, where the strength of the waves isn't very great, an area where there's very low tidal range, this is completely dominated. We don't have waves reshaping the sediment, moving the sediment around. We don't have tidal activity moving the sediment around. It's the rivers that are doing most of the work and having an influence on the appearance of the delta. So sediments transported by the river is deposited, and what we see is the formation of individual delta lobes. These individual lobes comprise a sediment that's being carried by the river and then deposited within this environment, and they begin to grow seawards. We'll see a little bit later on that the position of these delta lobes can switch over time. Now, in contrast, here is a river that's dominated by tides, and this is an example of the Ganges River Delta, the largest delta in the world. Huge, vast population lives on the land created by this delta. So here we still have the river, the Ganges River, bringing sediment down into the delta, but the tides here, the tidal influence dominates. So not a lot of reworking, reshaping of the delta by wave activity. It's basically tides that dominate. And in a tidal influence delta, what we see instead of sort of one main distributary channel with other channels branching off of them, we see a series of distributed channels that are perpendicular to the coastline, that parallel the direction of the tide. These new channels can be formed during times of high water level, during times of high tide, and over time they'll slowly fill up with sediment. So the tide comes in, the tide goes out. As the tide comes in, it deposits sediment within these channels, and then the tide goes back out. Over time, as I said, these channels will fill up with sediment, and new channels will be created. So what we end up here is, instead of having these sort of isolated little patches or little narrow edges along a distributed channel of land that's vegetated, we have these very long and narrow sand bodies that parallel the tide direction, separated by tidal channels, heavily vegetated. As I said, we find a large percentage of the population in this particular area of the world living within this particular delta. The third sort of type of delta that we can see is a wave-dominated delta. So remember, once again, these are end members. So we might have a delta that's sort of a combination of wave and tide-dominated. These are sort of the extreme cases. The wave-dominated delta is where we get the term delta from. So here we're looking at a delta off the coast of South America, but if you look at the Nile River Delta, and this is the delta we actually get the name delta from, you'll see that it actually appears to be the shape of a triangle. If you look in the Greek alphabet, the shape of the triangle represents the word or this letter delta. So this is how we get the term delta. Here in wave-dominated deltas, we see that wave erosion controls the shape. So that river is still bringing in sediment. We might have tides occurring, maybe not a great tidal regime, very low tidal range. But what we see here is wave erosion shapes the delta. So that sediment gets pushed out or brought out to the mouth of the river, deposited there, and then wave activity retakes that sediment and moves it in different directions. If deposition outweighs wave erosion, so if we have more material being brought out than what's being sometimes not only moved by waves, but removed by waves, so we have material removed by waves shaping the delta, but waves can also remove material offshore, then we see the delta is going to advance and grow outwards. What are some other features that we see with this delta? Very straight shorelines, beaches nicely developed, some with dunes that orientate themselves parallel to the coast. We see the development, and this is because of the dunes. As this delta grows, the dunes eventually become what we know as beach ridges. They become more heavily vegetated. And we also see sometimes associated with these, especially in more tropical areas, mangrove swamps. So this is a very typical wave-dominated delta. deltas, especially river-dominated deltas, we see a series of delta lobes being created because we're constantly feeding sediment into it over long periods of time. So in the case of the Mississippi River Delta, if we start looking at that area and start analyzing sediment within this area, we find that there's been different locations of deltas in the past. Here we see a location of the deltas, the last 6 deltas, the ages of which they were sort of active. The present lobe is known as the Mississippi Delta. That's number 6 there. And that's been active for about 600 years. But we see that as the river changes position on land, where the delta is located also changes position. So we have this delta lobe switching that occurs over time. And we'll finish off talking about deltas by looking at this really lovely photo of the Lena River Delta in Siberia. Once again, taken from space, data has been analyzed or the photo's been manipulated to give you these really unique colors. Here's a delta that extends for about 100 kilometers into the sea on top of it. It's about 400 kilometers wide. Most of the year it's frozen tundra, but when that tundra sort of during the summer thaws out a little bit, we get this shape with all these beautiful distributary channels moving off of the main channel.